DeepRoots. Today we are continuing the series with a deep dive into best practices for brand expansion. We've got a great show today. We have none other than Bethany Gomez, the founder and managing director of the Brightfield Group. Looking forward to chatting with her about whether brands really know their customers or not. Bethany, come on in and join the webinar. There she is.
All right. Hi, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. For those that don't know, Bethany, please give us a little bit of a background on who is the Brightfield Group.
Absolutely. Well, at Brightfield, we are really a consumer insights company that's really focused on understanding cannabis consumers and emerging products consumers in a whole new level of depth. We've really been obsessed with cannabis consumers and really digging into a wide variety of information. We're surveying more than 70,000 consumers of both cannabis and CBD per year. And, this really digs into cover everything from, your basic demographics to, their attitudes and usage of cannabis products, how it fits into their lifestyle, but also where brands fit into this landscape. So, how they interact with brands, what their preferences are when it comes to brands, how the brand loyalty is developing. We also integrate our surveys directly with social media, which is something that's unique that we do here at Brightfield. This means that we've been collecting digital profiles of cannabis consumers, back since 2019, and have a unique view into kind of the digital lives of consumers on platforms such as, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, and not only who they are as people. It gives you a real deep view as to kind of their personality profiles, but also really gives you a view as to their lifestyles. What are they following? What are they interacting with? What does their digital voice or kind of their social footprint really look like? That helps brands to develop those effective digital strategies and target effectively as well.
Excellent. We're gonna get into a lot of tactical strategies here, but I think the brand loyalty is really hard to capture. That data is really hard to capture. How do you actually go about the data capture piece of this? What do you capture?
Yeah, so we at Brightfield have been collecting data in the form of brand health tracking for several years now. And the way that this works, this is a standard tool that's used in CPG, although we'll get into some of the differences and how this impacts cannabis companies differently. But essentially, we're looking at, first of all, gauging which brands are cannabis consumers even aware of, right? What have they heard of? What's even on their radar? Of those brands that they're aware of, which would they even consider purchasing, right? Which is kind of getting into that consideration set. Of those that they consider purchasing, which ones do they actually go on to, move forward with? Which ones do they actually go on to buy? And if those that they're buying, which do they intend to purchase again, right? From that lens, we can also really dig in to see of those brands that consumers purchase, what was their experience? What do they have to say about them? Are they willing to purchase it again? Are they willing to recommend it to a friend? What is their satisfaction level? We found early on with many brands out in California, satisfaction levels were through the roof for just about all products, right? So this gives you kind of a, an understanding of, okay, if consumers are very satisfied about everything, then what else do they think about your brand, right? What attributes do they associate with your brand? What comes to their mind when they're thinking about your brand. And this can really be used to gauge the stickiness of your products. Many of our clients will also use, point of sale data to see, okay, this is what actually sold, but brand health gives you that other side of the coin to understand who bought it and why, and are they going to buy it again?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that a lot of companies spend a lot of time talking to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's logical, right? Sales and marketing, you got to get the word out. I got to tell you about us. And what you folks are doing, you understand that piece of the market, but you're also doing the listening, what the consumer feels about the brand.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what are the elements that go into establishing a brand feeling? How can you, as a brand owner, how can you drive these results?
Yeah. So, when it comes to kind of the development of a brand, you really have, an emotional ladder that, consumers really go up. And this is, been really interesting to see. This is kind of marketing, marketing fundamentals, marketing 101, that consumers first start by associating with an attribute or its functional benefits to kind of get them in the door. But as their relationship with brands evolve, then they start to have an emotional reaction to their brand. They start to hit those emotional benefits. As they work their way up the ladder, they have more kind of social benefits associated with a brand. But this takes, it takes a very long time to go from a commodity to Coca-Cola, right? And these brands where you can just put an icon and it elicits kind of emotional response from consumers. We're not there yet, in the cannabis space. But what we're seeing is this evolution beyond that initial phase where people were just buying a commodity or people were just buying based off of a certain product attribute. Many consumers still buy based off of product attributes, but as a company, it is your job, it is your marketer's job to make them remember you, right? Make them remember you, make them remember your brand and associate something memorable with that brand. And that's what we see, starting to happen in the cannabis space, with many key brands that are starting to differentiate or shoot off, from the pack and really kind of develop more of an iconic presence. But it takes time, and there's a lot of steps to kind of get in there.
So KYC, know your customer. Bethany, I talk to a lot of brands that say, it's really hard. We don't have the access to the data that we need. We want that point of sale data. And so without that point of sale data, they just go on assumptions of who loves their brand. Is that, I mean, you folks don't really look at it that way, right?
And the way that we encourage you to look at it, point of sale data is very valuable for understanding what sold in what place at what time. It's not going to tell you the who. It should not be fueling your marketing decisions. You need to figure out, as marketers, your marketing team needs to understand, first of all, who is the consumer segment that I'm targeting? And you cannot just paint this with a demographic brush. Women over the age of 45 is not a consumer group, right? You need to understand, your consumer segment and the psychographics, lifestyle, attitudes associated with those people, and how your brand can fit into their lifestyle, right? How your brand can fit into their, consumer segment. So you need to understand, first of all, who you are trying to hit, and then look at, are you actually doing that? Right? Are you hitting that? There's been so many misses that I've seen early on in the cannabis space where people think that they're targeting certain consumer segments, but when we look at the data, it turns out that's not actually the case. You've completely missed this consumer segment, you're hitting this other segment. Or you targeted this consumer segment, but that's not a big enough consumer segment to build a business model off of. And that happened with a lot of, brands that were trying to target a Canna Curious, consumer, for example. So getting some basic data that will give you a landscape of who the cannabis consumer is, where other brands are positioned in the market, and where you can carve out your white space is, absolutely mission critical. Otherwise, you're just launching into an oversaturated market, very, a densely competitive market, with potentially a product that if you don't brand it right, it's just a commodity and you're not going to see the long-term value of that. Now, at Brightfield, we started doing, brand health tracking. Brand health tracking is something that is typically done by agencies, that is customized for every individual client. It is very, very expensive to do and very prohibitive for small brands in the space. At Brightfield, what we've done, because we know the cannabis industry is populated by many small brands that are also looking to understand their consumers, is that we've developed a syndicated model that allows brands to, instead of having to pay for an entire study or an entire tracker all themselves, they can sign on to a syndicated subscription that gives them a dive into, their state, for example. So if you just want to understand what's going on in Illinois, and who the Illinois cannabis consumer is and where your brand is ranking up versus the competition, and where, the main brands are positioned, so you can find all of that white space. We have packages that are very kind of approachable for, for single state operators, using the syndication model.
I think that's really helpful, because I think I know I've spoken to the brands, and a lot of them are saying, well, I have assumptions, I need to
Mhm.
validate them, I don't know how to get started. And this sounds like a great way for kind of an easy on ramp for you to get started looking into this, because at the end of the day, you're trying to validate that assumption, right? Is it true that soccer moms, love my product, or is it, is it a completely different demographic? So maybe you could talk to, like, what are some practical strategies to onboarding, like just getting started looking at this? What are things that can help you that are like fact based, and that ultimately validate your assumptions?
So validating your assumptions is always something that people should do because, especially coming into this category, a lot of people have kind of certain ideas about what may have happened. And many of the times that is related to their own personal experience. And then they project their own personal experience on kind of what the market is overall. This industry, while it's still nascent and emerging, it's been around for long enough that we do have good data on it now. That's not really the same situation that it was, 10 years ago. So for example, if you are looking to launch a brand, what you should do, number one, think about who your target consumer is, right? And then check from a basic level, look at what is the size of that consumer segment, right? How many people actually fall into that segment? How much money do they spend, right? Is this enough to build a business around, right? What else are they buying? I'm going to use the example of cannabis drinks right now because I think this is where we see a lot of kind of miscalculations from companies that have kind of projected their own kind of experiences or thoughts of what they thought this could be, and the data showing a much different story. You may think that you want to target soccer moms for a cannabis drinks, but what I encourage you to do is come in and take a look at, okay, first of all, what is the size of soccer moms that are using cannabis, right? Or are open to cannabis? Okay, size of that opportunity. How much do they spend? Are they actually purchasing drinks, right? Is that the target drinks consumer, right? When we look at these areas, we usually find that actually in the drink space, that's not who's consuming drinks. It actually skews male. It skews towards experienced cannabis consumers who are mixing this into their overall, their, other formats that they use. And this is something that they use for some of their occasions of consumption, for example. And then you want to take a look at, okay, who my consumer segment is. What else are they buying? What occasions of use are they using for? And how does my product fit into these use cases? At this juncture, more than 75% of cannabis consumers are using at least 5 times per week. Many of them are using multiple times a day, and they use many different form factors. So how does your product fit into this larger lifestyle alongside all of their other products? You should have a vision of kind of the size of this opportunity and where you're going to fit in there. Otherwise, you're just coming in blind to kind of a very basic and, with a basic value proposition to a very saturated market, which is going to make it very difficult to break through. Then you want to think about your unique selling point, your value proposition. Look at that against all of the other brands that are competing for that same consumer segment, whether that's in your category or across other categories that consume. You want to think about that attribute, that descriptor, that that value proposition that is unique for your brand, that is digestible and consumers can get behind, and make it easy for them to understand why they should buy their brand, why they should buy your brand, right? And then that's your messaging, right? Then you get that out as far and wide as possible and make people remember you that way.
Let's talk a little bit about like the portability of a message from market to market, right? I imagine there's already been an evolution of what consumers thought about brands 2 or 3 years ago and what they think about today. I read recently that it's the Gen Z that like apparently loves vapes over flour. What have you seen already that has occurred in the process to kind of brand adoption and brand awareness that that in a mature market like California or Colorado, now we're into Missouri and new markets, and now some on the East Coast. What are the things that the consumer can look at, or sorry, the brand can look at to track this evolution?
Yeah, it's fascinating to watch the brands evolve within the cannabis space. When we first started doing this back in 2015, the market was so commoditized. Consumers were not thinking about brands. For the most part, there was, the idea of branded flower was almost unheard of, at the time. There was just, brands were just not really on the landscape of most consumers. Fast forward, even when we're looking at, 2020, at this juncture, less than 40% of consumers, only about 33% of consumers were identifying brands as one of the top attributes that they look for when they were shopping, right? Very attribute driven. This was a very, price and attributes were kind of the primary thing that, that consumers really looking for, and their awareness on a lot of brands was fairly limited, right? Fast forward, to 2023, now we're seeing more than 45% of consumers that are identifying brands as a key attribute that they look for with consumer or when they're purchasing brands. So it's an evolution. We're not at the final innings yet. I think we're, if you think about it in a landscape of a baseball game, I think we're in about inning 3 or 4 in the evolution from full commodity, baggy on the street to Coca-Cola, right? We're in about that inning 3 and 4, and brands, that are smart are really putting their best marketers out there, crafting that brand and getting that, far and wide, both in the minds of, of consumers as well as bud tenders. But really, when we see brands expand into new states and we see new markets open, you have to kind of create that whole brand awareness from scratch again. And that's really hard, especially for brands that have been doing so well and have such kind of household name recognition, out in Colorado or California to wrap their heads around, going into Illinois, going into Michigan, going into Massachusetts, Ohio, these brands, in these, newer markets that are very far from a California or a Colorado, even Nevada, that gets a lot of the tourism, play. You have to start from scratch in building that brand awareness. And in any new market, the most often, we do lots of, qualitative with consumers as well. You'll ask them, okay, what brand do you purchase? And say, I don't know, name me a few. Okay, is that the one with the white package? Is that the one with the, yuzu flavor? Is that the one with the this? Is that the one that's fast acting? Is that the one with the, that? And it takes a while for them to build up. And, this is always a challenge, especially for people coming over from CPG, who are used to this level of kind of brand equity and brand development. For most consumer packaged goods products, there's some peripheral knowledge about brands, whether you purchase it or not. If you've ever walked down the shelves of the aisles of a supermarket, you have heard of Doritos, right? You have heard of Coca-Cola. You've heard of a lot of these key brands, whether you purchase them or not, because they're, out there in TV ads and billboards. They're out there in your, just as part of your supermarket experience. But if you've never set foot into a dispensary before, you probably don't know any cannabis brands, and you probably don't know anything about any cannabis brands. And even it's a very overwhelming experience for people to first start shopping, and they don't remember very many things at the beginning. It takes time and time and time and time again. And, it's really that very tactical level of, in your face, branding that is going to help them remember, your brand over time. A few years down the line, they remember it so much better than they did that first couple of months. But that means that even if you have a fantastic brand elsewhere, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to activate in new states. And that's the challenge of this kind of state by state patchwork of a market that we have here in the US.
Yeah, no question. Are there certain KPIs that you would say, all right, this is mission critical, this is the industry data you need? Like, are there certain areas that you would say focus on these KPIs when you do that? Because I mean, that's fascinating. There are a lot of California brands like, well, we're California brands. We've been a brand for 10 years and we know weed, or whatever the message is. That doesn't matter in Massachusetts, right? I mean, or if it does, it matters to a very small select group of consumers. So what are those KPIs that you see as being particularly valuable for a brand to hone in on?
So number one is awareness, right? If people do not remember your brand, they are not going to be likely to buy it again, right? And this is something that is, again, very, very common, even with brands that may sell through early. This is common if you're doing discounting. It's common if you have a pretty package. People still may not remember your brand. So it's critical that you look at awareness and track that as a key metric that you want to focus on, both on a aided, we capture this both on unaided and an aided basis. So if we just ask consumers, what brands have you heard of? If we're asking this about, colas, people can rattle off the top brands, whether they buy them or not. If you ask this about vapes or about gummies, can they name your brand, right? That's kind of what you want to go for. It's a longer term play, but that's what you want to go for. So, definitely unaided awareness, aided awareness is critical. If they can't even recognize your brand name in a lineup, that is, your brand is vulnerable, right? And that equity is what, again, your long-term value is. So looking at unaided and aided, you certainly want to look at that intent to repurchase, right? Or those loyalty rates. So if people bought your product once, but they don't care about it, then that is a wasted dollar. That is a wasted customer acquisition cost, right? And then their willingness to recommend, or their net promoter score, is really a key basic metric that many brands use to really look at, okay, how many of my customers are willing to recommend me to their friends? The promoters minus the detractors, people who are saying nasty things about you. So you really want to have not only a brand that people remember, but people will recommend. And then just looking at satisfaction. That's something that you should always keep an eye on, is your satisfaction metrics, your ratings amongst consumers, because as soon as those fall off, that is the canary in a coal mine to see that you have an issue. And that may be that you have a product problem. It may be that the market has grown up around you in ways that you weren't aware of, or a number of different issues, but essentially that is your canary in the coal mine. And if those numbers go down, or if those numbers are not strong, you have a very serious problem that no amount of marketing dollars is going to fix.
You touched on some of the things that changed about what people know about a brand. One of the big discussions in the industry for years now has been authenticity, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's, some people would look at that discussion through the lens of, I've been around for a long time. I used to do this before it was legal, and whatever that story may be. But where are we on the continuum of authenticity being a critical selling point for brands?
Yeah, it's a really interesting stage in development right now, because early on there was kind of the folks that were some of the pioneers in the industry, and they were the first people to do this in the legal market. And whether that was brownies or gummies or vapes or any whatever it is that they were doing, the amount of times that I heard early on, well, we have the best strains, and so this is unparalleled, nobody can touch it, so we're just going to be off the charts. There was kind of that whole evolution of the first people in the industry, and because we're here first, we're going to capture the authenticity of this market, and we're going to be what takes it forward. That in and of itself has proven to not be enough for consumers right now, to really resonate with consumers authentically now, right? Authenticity doesn't have to mean that you were there first, right? It means that you understand them as a consumer, and that you are building an emotional connection with them and resonating with them. And that doesn't have to be from, legacy in the market, right? At this juncture, good products, high quality strains, high quality gummies, high quality products have really become table stakes in many industries. This isn't always many states. This isn't always the case with new markets. There's some quality humps to get over. But once we get over that quality hump, then most of the products are pretty good, right? So, just legacy isn't always enough there, right? But you have to prove yourself to be kind of part of the cannabis culture. And there was, a second evolution in the cannabis industry that was a bit of a sanitization of the cannabis industry, where everybody wanted to kind of appeal to everyone. We want to make cannabis approachable for everyone in the market. We want it to be okay for your grandma to walk in. We want it to be okay for for your mom. We want it to be okay for everyone. And some of that branding, what we see in the data is a lot of that branding has fallen flat, and we see a lot more resonance with brands that are really targeting consumers that cannabis is part of their culture and they're proud of it. They're part of their lifestyle. I mean, 75% of cannabis consumers are using at least 5 times per week. That is a lot of people, right? And when we're talking about, this in terms of north of 20% of the entire adult population, this is a massive market. And when we see brands like, Cookies develop, or Jungle Boys develop, that, or Steezy even develop, that have more of, Cookies is a really good example of a brand that wasn't necessarily the biggest brand in 2014, but they have developed a level of authenticity and connection with the cannabis, with heavy cannabis consumers of different personas, that is really resonating, and it makes people want to not only use their products and buy their products and make them the #1 brand in many of the places that they're located, but also you start to see it everywhere in terms of branding and swag and things like that. And that's really what authenticity means today, I think, in in the cannabis market. It's more around building that connection with who the cannabis consumer is today, and not necessarily trading on kind of the legacy market.
Yeah, it sounds like the the old school initially, when a state turns on and the old school comes out of the woodworks to go to dispensaries, they might value that authenticity, or maybe even like the culture, the hustle of cannabis brands and smaller brands. But and they might be a great, early adoption, customer for a brand, under the belief that that person will then go around and tell their story and help be a brand ambassador. But I guess the new consumers you're talking about, the new consumers coming on board, are probably looking at it through a slightly different lens. While they appreciate the hustle and the authenticity, you're saying there's other ways to achieve authenticity with your message of what you stand for and your culture that is different than being a trap band brand from the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that and what I mean to say here is that I think that there's a lot of ways to capture authenticity, with your consumers, and really know it. You don't have to have already been around and already been part of the cannabis market for 10 years to have authenticity with consumers. There's a lot of consumer segments, especially in new markets, where they aren't necessarily being served yet, and being able to carve out a position that you can own authentically and really get in front of your consumers and really connect with those consumers, is a great way to be able to build authenticity. And it's important to have that. The cannabis hustle, I think, is something that is so crucial to brands to be successful. It's like you have to be, even though we're 10 years, nearly 10 years into the rec markets, of cannabis overall, these are still emerging startup industries, and you have to have that kind of, that hustle to be able to get boots on the ground, get in front of people, make it happen, make it work, and really, build that development. For example, I was talking with a few brands about their 420s, and some brands, for example, they have kind of their systems and they'll send things out, and there's a lot of competition, but they would expect that people would come into their dispensaries, and this should be kind of a mission as usual. Okay, we'll check out what's happening. And other brands would divvy up their staff, and they would have everybody go hit 15 dispensaries and bring something to their the bud tenders, and be able to talk with customers and really kind of get that boots in the ground in front of people, and that kind of hustle, like that kind of showing up for people, showing up for your customers, showing up for your bud tenders, that's authenticity, right? That makes a difference, and that kind of, one of the biggest mistakes that we see people make is really in starving their field marketing budgets when they're activating in new markets, right? You need boots on the ground. I don't care what your brand is, right? You need boots on the ground, to get in front of people in this new market, right? You need to get in front of your bud tenders. They don't care how well you did in other states. They want to see you, and they want to be, catered to, right? They want you to woo them over, right? Your consumers, they want you, they want to be able to find something to engage with about your brand. And that's the way that you kind of build new brands and build new, a new presence, in place, as you're growing. And that's what kind of builds that over time. Through boots on the ground. Social is also a great way to do it too, but it can't be an exclusion from boots on the ground.
So let's continue on that line of, we're going to get tactical here, because I think we want to take a deep dive into best practices. We want to understand, I think the listeners want to understand, what are practical things that they can do. So you mentioned before, a lot of brands are expanding into new markets, where in those new markets, with very few exceptions, consumers don't know the brand. So they don't know anything about my brand. What are things that you can recommend that they do, even pre-launch? What are tactical things that you can do pre-launch, at launch, and that help kind of advance the ball? And again, not a lot of money. No one's got millions of dollars to just put it out there on billboards, right? What are things that you can do out of the gate that are just kind of down and dirty and like a lot of elbow grease to kids?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. You don't necessarily need millions of dollars to be able to do a strong activation, right? It's certainly great if you do, but you can have all of your billboards and things like that, but that in of itself isn't enough, right? You have to be able to, you have to take that cannabis hustle and run, right? Get in front of people, get your boots on the ground. First of all, you need to know who your consumer is, and need to know your value proposition like that. Consumers are not going to understand your 5-paragraph things that are different about your brand, right? You need 1 or 2 things that they are going to remember about your brand. You are the brand who blank, right? And you have to know who you're targeting. Okay, I'm targeting, the X, Y, and Z consumer segment. I want them to know X, Y, and Z about me. That's different from the competition because of why, right? That is kind of the package. Then you get that same consistent message out in front of as many people as possible. So you show up to all of those dispensaries, you schedule it in advance, you talk to your bud tenders, you present to your bud tenders, you give them their samples whenever in whatever regulatory environment loopholes allow you to do that, but they need to try your products. You want it to get in front of them, get your brand in front of them, get them recommending, ready to recommend your brand, and do that in as many dispensaries as possible. Then you want to hit the local events. And I'm not talking huge conferences. I'm not talking big booths. I've seen so many brands waste so much money on massive booths at all these places where it's just like your customers aren't there. That's not going to give you an ROI, right? It's every new market has these small local events that are for either people in the industry or consumers that really love cannabis and are part of maybe formal influencers or informal influencers, but this is like the kind of heart and soul of a lot of cannabis, the way that you get in the door, right? You cater to those people, and they're small events. They're not like, you don't need to buy things out, but go get in front of people that way, and, and talk to people, share about your brand, talk to people, about your launch, and get, really hit those kinds of areas. And then you want to have a social strategy, right? To be able to get things out farther and wider, but make it simple, make it consistent, and make them remember you. And I think that's, that's kind of the primary package. I think it's so important to do the, the homework up front to craft your strong value proposition, get the data, figure out who your consumer is, figure out what your message is, test that your consumer is actually going to care about that, right? Get kind of your, your package in place, and then it should be heavy boots on the ground.
Yeah. And Bethany, I'm not a marketing guru, but I do recall back to kind of the differentiation of marketing budgets and spend, where you've got below the line marketing and above the line marketing, right? And this sounds like a ton of below the line marketing, right? The guerrilla tactics, grassroots tactics, get out, tell two people who tell two people.
Right.
That seems to be like, and that's cost effective, right? I mean, it's time, but it's day in, day out, getting the word out.
Right. And the thing about cannabis is while there's a lot of things working against cannabis, again, you aren't going to know a cannabis brand the same way that you're going to know a brand that you've walked past on the supermarket a million times, but cannabis consumers love cannabis far more than cereal consumers love cereal. Nobody cares about their cereal the same way that they care about their cannabis. And they don't care about their beer really to the same extent that they care about their cannabis. Maybe an exception for some, craft beer aficionados, but the relationship that people have with cannabis runs so much deeper than it does in just about any other industry. So your key to success as a brand is unlocking that passion, right? And you have to know your consumers. You have to be able to resonate with your consumers, in an authentic way, but unlock that passion and your brand is off to the races.
Nice. I want to dive in a moment to like bud tenders and influencers, but one more question on this same topic. Then there's the feedback loop, okay? How do we think about the feedback loop? I mean, ultimately, you're trying to determine if the consumers are receptive to your marketing message. How do you track that? Because you want to develop this, you want to know how the brand feels about your product and your brand. How do you track that feedback loop, and how do you refine and track maybe?
Yeah. So the way that we think about brand tracking, right, is, there's several different kind of phases of that funnel that allow you to track different attributes about your branding, right? So I talked about kind of the awareness, the consideration, the purchase, the loyalty, the attributes. If we're looking at kind of the funnel, number one, have people heard of you? That's your awareness metric, right? If that's your dipstick to see if your initiatives have been working, right? Have you been getting the message out about your brand? Now, if you look from awareness to consideration, that will tell you, is your message landing? For example, a lot of people will work with a celebrity influencer, for example, to try to jack up, to launch their business. And that'll be a good way to jack up your awareness. Everybody's heard of the brand with, X celebrity, right? And that can get a very high, the Dog the Bounty Hunter CBD brand, let's put it that way, right? Is that something that, yes, there was a press release, yes, a lot of people heard about it. Are they going to think about purchasing it, right? Are they going to consider it? Okay, I've heard of it. I don't necessarily trust CBD from Dog the Bounty Hunter, so therefore, no, I am not going to consider purchasing it. I fell off the funnel. Everything you just spent on your awareness is now wasted, right? If people are thinking about buying you, do they actually go on to purchase your brand, right? This consideration to purchase, this lets you know if you are successful at kind of closing the deal, right? Are you successful on shelf, right? And, in cannabis, a lot of this comes down to the bud tenders, right? How are you doing in store? People are thinking about you. Okay. If they're thinking about you and they're thinking about 3 other brands, did they choose your brand or did they choose other brands? That is either how you are presented in store, whether that's on menus, whether that's on shelf, that's any in-store collateral, in-store, in-store advertising, in-store, marketing, or that's the bud tender predominantly, right? And bud tenders influence about 50% of purchases. So, that's a good way of tracking, okay, Yep, people heard of me. Yes, people liked my message. Okay, my message is landing. My advertising is working. Where did we go? Can we close the deal, right? Or do we need to go into more of that, that tactical marketing, right? And then after that, the look at kind of purchase to loyalty or intent to repurchase, those customer satisfaction scores, the attributes about your product. Do people like your product? Do they like where they sold what they thought they were getting? Is is the product experience what they were expecting? Are they going to repeat purchase? So those metrics really give you that, a kind of a clean dipstick on like what you're looking at each stage of the funnel, and to what extent your marketing dollars have been successful. And this gives you a toolkit to be able to say, okay, well, my awareness is really high, but my message needs some work, so therefore we're going to work on some messaging. Maybe we want to rebrand. Let's test this in front of a few consumers, make some adjustments to the messaging. Okay, we'll get this out into the market, and now we've adjusted and we see how this goes, and track how well this is going from there. All of those areas give you kind of that ability to treat this, approach this in a data-driven way, engage what's working and what isn't working, because inevitably in a new market, things aren't always going to work perfectly the first time. You have to be ready, and able to make some adjustments, rejigger, and kind of then move forward, right?
I think you talk about how the brands kind of develop these relationships with the bud tenders, which I think is fascinating. A quick reminder, we are going to take some questions here as well, meant to say. So if you have some questions for Bethany, please fire them through. But I think that what's so fascinating, what you just said, is that bud tenders influence 50% of the purchasing. And so I think of that, and I think of my experiences, and I go in and I quiz bud tenders. They don't. I mean, I'm not a secret shopper or anything like that, but I just want to hear what they know about certain products that I know a lot about to see. And it's obviously all over the map. But because they're the gatekeeper of many brands' success. What are the ways? I mean, on the one hand, there's the swag and giving them your product. But on the other hand, like if you're telling them, well, I'm women owned, or it's all about being carbon neutral. Like, well, people don't walk up typically to a bud tender and say, I want a women owned and operated cannabis edible company manufacturer. So how do you, it's complicated. What are the successful strategies that you can have influencing bud tenders about your brand? What are, again, I think this is probably, not only do you need to do it, but it doesn't seem to be incredibly expensive outside of the labor cost of showing up, right? How do you look at that from the bud tender perspective, and how to get them hooked on selling your brand to consumers when they've got thousands of SKUs in the back room?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the real question, right? We're actually about ready to launch or release a study we did on bud tenders in Canada, and we found, that there's a wide variety of things that really kind of impact bud tender recommendations. But as they recommend cannabis products to all sorts of different people that fall into all sorts of different kind of use cases and occasions, right? And you need to be able to, with the bud tenders, there's different attributes about brands that are going to stick out in their minds. To your point, there are so many SKUs that are available, and there's so many brands that are out there. So your key job as a marketer, as a brand, is to be able to have something very distinct about your brand that they're going to remember, and get that into the minds of bud tenders, so that they will associate you with whatever use case people are talking about. You're right. Most people aren't going to come in and ask for a carbon neutral vape, right? They're going to say, hey, I think I want a vape, and I'm looking for this experience, kind of, this is my price point. What should I get, right? They all look the same to me, kind of thing. And so in that use case, what is that bud tender going to recommend, right? They're going to recommend the product that they've tried and they liked, right? They're going to recommend a product that is going to, stick out to them with any specific attributes about, those products, or, about those products that are going to resonate with this consumer, right? For their heavy consumers, they're going to target it just to their favorite brands, right? If they're targeting, if they're talking to a newer user, or, somebody with a lower tolerance level, or, more of an occasional consumer, they need to have some attributes about the products that they would know to recommend, even if it may not be their favorite product, or even if they may not even feel anything when they use it, but they need to get kind of that feedback about the product, to be able to, feel confident in recommending. There's definitely an authenticity, component, to come back to this term, with, bud tenders as well. Bud tenders will not necessarily just recommend the brands of the companies that they work in. And this is something that is not always, that surprises a lot of companies, especially if executives are coming in from big CPG companies. Well, okay, we own, the dispensary, and so therefore the bud tenders are just going to recommend all of our stuff. And you have to remember that in cannabis, nobody gets into cannabis because they love to follow the rules, or they love to be told what to do, right? So the amount of bud tenders that, actively refuse to recommend, or recommend against, brands from some of the bigger companies that they view as the man, or, have inferior quality, or treat their employees poorly, or, things like that. It doesn't matter if they're being instructed to promote something, they're not going to do it. And they may actively, detract from your brand. I remember the first time I went into a dispensary up in Canada, it had a partnership with one of the big LPs. And I was shocked I was trying to get the bud tender to recommend this product for me. And they're like, no, it's okay. I mean, just go based off of
Either fire or it's not. I ain't recommending it if it's not.
What about this one? Could this maybe be a good one? Nah.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because I talk to brands, and one of the things I hear from them, some of the smaller brands, they're like, look, I've established a market position in what I would, consider to be a niche, right? It's a small segment. So maybe I should go into a new market and leverage my brand and maybe launch gummies, when they've actually done all the work to win in their niche, even if it's small. Would you, recommend that, like, going into new markets with like little niche products is actually a good strategy? Do you need to kind of think about, my mailbox checks aren't going to be big enough if I'm selling a very, specific form factor? Would you think it bodes well for going into a new market with niche products, because then you can carve out your space? Or is it always about land and expand? How do you think about those smaller brands that are worried about the time and effort and energy that it takes to do it with a product that, frankly, whether that's a beverage or a tea or something that's just maybe off the beaten path, isn't going to generate massive amount of revenue?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is where I think it's really important for niche brands to really understand the size of the opportunity for what they're going after, right? Because it could go either way depending on how big that niche is, or how well you can attract other consumers into that niche, right? I know we had talked about this before. Do you want to be brand number 327 that sells gummies in California? Probably not, right? Probably not kind of the greatest way to scale a business. On the other hand, if you're trying to sell, corner the infused beef jerky market, and the infused beef jerky market isn't big enough to sustain a business, that isn't necessarily a direction that's profitable either, even if you're the only one that makes them, right? So it's important to be able to really see and have a clear view into the numbers, right? Into the size of the opportunity, and is that big enough to sustain you? There's plenty of areas, in cannabis while there are so many brands that are out there already, they do all, many of those brands kind of target the same areas or target the same consumers. And so you don't necessarily you don't want to just launch into a very saturated segment of the market where everybody else is. You have to have your unique positioning. You have to have your unique, reason why you're better, right? Or where you can win or why consumers should choose you. But as a business owner, you need to really, really carefully look at the size of that opportunity and if that's worthwhile to create a business around. And the magic is in the details there.
Yeah, excellent. So we have some good questions. I'm going to get to that in a moment, but one more topic here that I want to hit on, and that's the influencers, right? Mm-hmm. What are the pros and cons of working with influencers?
Yeah, so first of all, you have to make sure that the influencers actually represent what you want to say about your brand, right? If you are using them as the face of your brand, or as a way to drive, more people into your brand, you need to make sure that, they kind of match with your values. So that's kind of standard practice with influencers overall. But influencers can be very powerful, especially local ones. And I think the, local ones, micro kind of, more, influencers that have authenticity, again, coming back to that keyword there, with the market that you're looking at, a lot of people will blow a lot of money trying to get celebrity, influencers when they just don't resonate. You don't see the top brands in the space being celebrity brands, and you don't see the top brands in the space with celebrity influencers. That's not usually the thing that will clinch it. It's more of spreading your seeds farther and wider and just showing you're part of the community in each of these areas that you're trying to go. That is important, but it's also important to look at those influencers as they relate to your target consumer segment, because it's very easy to go very far awry by saying, oh, well, this person has so many followers, and it's like, great, but they're targeting totally different, their entire audience is very different from your consumer brand, right? So making sure kind of that message is resonating, and you always see a lot of hot water that brands get into if they pick the wrong direction with their influencer. So this is where it kind of comes back to really know your consumers. At Brightfield, we look at both kind of who your consumer is and give you kind of a lens into your consumers, but because we also track where they are on social, it gives us a view into who they follow from both influencers, media sources, and all sorts of different aspects there. So it's if you start with your consumer and kind of put your consumer at the heart of everything that you do, whether that's your product development strategy, your, expansion strategy, your, your marketing, your branding, your influencer, all of, your, all of your strategies. This is a consumer packaged goods industry, and you need to put, know your consumer really well and put your consumer at the heart of that. And that will help to kind of unlock, the success.
Yeah, I imagine that it's similar. Like you approach an influencer, whether that's a skateboarder or politician or whatever it may be that you've identified. It's important to be able to articulate why that influencer is a good brand ambassador, and obviously there's the economic and commercial agreement that goes alongside, but everyone needs to know that the engagement's going to be successful. So being able to say, as the brand, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, and that's why we're sitting here in front of you talking, is a great way to get off the mark here, to get started with influencers. Are there? We tend to hear about the negatives of, like, I worked with an influencer, I spent a bunch of money for a couple of likes. But what are some of the success stories you're hearing out there, and how does that kind of drive the social media strategy of some of the brands?
Yeah, I mean, I think with influencers, we have seen a lot of success in key market activations with many key brands, right? And building your success, in a state like Illinois, for example, that's where, where I'm based here, building your success in a state like Illinois, having a lot of boots on the ground is very important. And, the influencers within the community have been, very successful in helping to, get some more of that, the message out. But you can't just pick one or two. You don't necessarily go with these like big, big influencers that are going to put all your eggs in one basket and, really move the market. It's really a matter of, hustling and getting in front of, a lot of people that can just hit that same message, consistently. I think the bigger fails have been with the bigger the celebrity, the bigger the fail oftentimes, right?
Great. Got an interesting question here. I'm going to read it. There's a couple of questions buried in this, but I'll read the question to you. In this tough market for brands and retailers, how do you convince folks that spending money on capturing data and developing a brand is important and should be budgeted for? To further, it says the green rush and lack of maturity in this market has made it difficult for companies like mine to convince them that the differentiation you're talking about is worth the spend. Do you have data to support the spend in this or other maturing or competitive markets? I think that's right up your alley, Steph.
That is right up my alley, and that's kind of the conversation that we're always having, with companies. I think we have seen just time and time again, companies that have not developed a data-driven company and that have just rolled out whatever they, was on a founder's mind, are the companies that fail in very saturated markets. In cannabis, you are only as good as your brand, right? And your long-term success is going to really depend on your brand, because there's only so many differentiation points that you can put on your on your products. There's only so many differentiation points you can put on pricing and things of that nature. So your long-term strategy always has to rely on brands, and the companies that do, we see our clients becoming overwhelmingly more successful in outcompeting the market overall. But you don't have to be a big company to be able to spend on data. You don't have to be a big company to be able to develop this kind of a data-driven culture. There's a lot of smaller packages that are available that if people really use them and people really develop this kind of culture and approach early on, that allows you to stay ahead of the curve in the market there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we have one more minute. I'm going to ask you one more question. I have a new business plan. I am going to create a brand that is going to sell exclusively to soccer moms. And I want to know, am I going to be successful by penetrating the soccer mom category?
Oh, there's so many challenges with this, this kind of a positioning. So as a proud soccer mom myself, I have to say, number one, it's important to understand that not all soccer moms are the same, right? Especially when it comes to cannabis consumers. When I look around, the soccer fields, we find that there's, many consumers, many moms that are out there that are heavy consumers, and they may be thinking about cannabis and, very open about their cannabis usage. There's a lot of other, they may use flower, they may use vapes, they may have been using for years, and legacy consumers. On the other hand, there's a lot of moms that are new to cannabis now that it becomes legal. The things that I hear very frequently are, "Isn't it great that gummies are legal now?" Right? So there's a lot of different personas that fall into just moms, right? So really understanding who you're targeting there. But a lot of times people are targeting the moms that are new, that are just trying cannabis now that it's legal, right? And trying to approach that. Now, that is a big fail that I've seen in a lot of brands. And as much as I love to have products created after me, I am not your target market, right? Because, when you look at that occasional consumer, it is in new consumers, it is oftentimes very expensive to try to acquire that new consumer, to try to get them into the dispensary to begin with, right? Once they go into the dispensary, it's very difficult to convince them to buy your product versus other products. It's important to know kind of the basic entry point. Usually gummies are, but looking at kind of that basic entry point, but they don't know the brands. They're going to go with whatever the bud tender is recommending because they don't they're not doing all of their research. And quite frankly, if they don't use very often, they don't buy very often. They don't spend very often. For occasional, consumers, a pack will last you a very long time. And, that is going to, you cut your gummies in half, that's going to, be a pretty good, go for a pretty long time. And, so we see a lot of brands that spend a lot of money to acquire these consumers that are not very valuable because they don't keep buying and spending, over and over and over again. Meanwhile, there's this whole huge segment of the market over here that is like 75% of consumers that are, spending a lot, using frequently, trying all sorts of new products. If you can win over, certain consumers that are heavier users, whether they're moms or whether they are not, right? Corner an occasion of their consumption and then get more and more and more of their occasions, that's a more sustainable business model. So, being really cautious. And I think that the biggest piece of advice, wherever, however you think about it, whatever your budget is make sure you really know the size of the opportunity of what you are going after, because it's the easiest way to miscalculate in cannabis, and it's so crowded. So.
Well, we ran a little over, but we had to do the soccer mom question there. So, Bethany, thank you so much. Wonderful insight. I'm sure everybody learned a ton from this. Thank you so much for coming on.